Is the million dollar question, right? Really, the million dollar question that everyone asks. What breaks a fast? And before I go into that, the first question you need to ask yourself when thinking about this question is, what is my goal? Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about everything you need to know about intermittent fasting. So here's what we're going to cover is what is IF or IE for some of you who haven't heard of that term? How long do you need to fast? What's ideal based on your goals? The third thing is what to eat before or after a fast. Four, what breaks a fast, right? What can you have? What can't you have? And number five is how to accelerate the benefits of a fast. So let's jump into it. So first off, who's heard of the term IF, right? IF stands for intermittent fasting, right? We've all heard that term, right? So you might be thinking, what is IE? Well, before I jump into it, let me tell you a quick story. So a lot of times we know the benefits of some of these techniques, right? I've talked about fasting several times before, and I talk about it with my family members all the time. And I was having a conversation with someone in my family, and I said, hey, here's kind of the intermittent fasting schedule that I think would be best for you. Here's kind of my approach. And they're like, fasting? That sounds terrible. My doctor told me I can't do that. It sounds like I'm depriving myself of nutrients and food. I said, fine, you know what? We're not going to do intermittent fasting. In fact, there's this cool, new, amazing technique. It's actually called intermittent eating. And she was like, oh my God, that sounds amazing. Like, yeah, I'm super interested in it. And in reality, it's the exact same thing. It's just psychologically, a lot of times people think deprivation when they think fasting. So sometimes I approach it with people and just say, no, we're not going to do any of that fasting. We're just going to do intermittent eating. And we're going to eat within a certain time window. And they're like, oh, that sounds amazing. But the reality is, whether it's intermittent fasting or intermittent eating, if you were to define it, it's not a diet. A lot of times you see headlines or some of these news stories say, oh, intermittent fasting is a new diet. It's not a diet, right? You can eat any way and incorporate in intermittent fasting or intermittent eating. In fact, I hope and I pray that every single one of you do some type of intermittent fasting or intermittent eating, because guess what? No matter who you are, where you're from, ideally you're getting what, 6 to 8 hours of sleep. We all go through periods where we're fasting when we're sleeping. Now, how we incorporate that outside of that fasting when we're sleeping is things we'll discuss today. So if we had to define it, it's really an eating pattern that cycles between periods of fasting and eating. So it is not a diet. It is not something new. It's something we've done for many, many, many years. In fact, our ancestors went through many periods of fasting and feasting, right? Feast and famine. They would hunt, they would go out, they would eat some type of animal or something that they were able to capture, and then they would fast until their next hunt, right? So this isn't new. It's not a new style of dieting. And in fact, it's an eating pattern that cycles between fasting and eating. So let's jump into a little bit more of the science and really the benefits of what intermittent fasting holds. The first one, and I think the most exciting, is the anti-aging benefits. So if we look here, if we were to ask ourselves, what's the number one way published in thousands of research articles to anti-age? The real answer is calorie restriction. We know, and there's you all have likely seen two different pictures of monkeys where one and it looks really young, full of hair, amazing. The other one looks beaten. He's got bed sores, he's got rashes, all these different things. And you say, which one's older? And the reality is they're both the same age. It's just one of those monkeys had been calorically restricted their entire life. And so we know the benefits of caloric restriction for anti-aging and longevity, right? The reality is it's very difficult to chronically calorically restrict. I don't know about you guys, but like restricting every single day by 500 or 750 calories is very difficult to do, and 99.99% of the population can't do that, nor is it, and it's not sustainable for most people, right? We know by shows like The Biggest Loser where they significantly calorically restrict and they're unable to keep that long term. Yet there are studies that have looked at caloric restriction versus intermittent periods of eating or intermittent periods of fasting and actually found very similar benefits for longevity. And they've seen that animals can live 36 to 83% longer lives when incorporating in periods of intermittent fasting or intermittent eating, right? Incredible. Possibly because they're calorically restricting during that eating window, but it's much more sustainable than just chronic caloric restriction without doing periods of intermittent fasting. The second one I want to talk about is body composition, right? Everyone wants to lose fat and maintain or gain muscle. And so there's been studies on this and actual reviews that have seen anywhere from 0.8 to 13% of body weight can be lost when incorporating in periods of intermittent fasting. And I know the immediate question then goes to what happens with muscle, right? Don't you just lose a ton of muscle? No. And in fact, this is where intermittent fasting shines compared to caloric restriction, because with typical caloric restriction, you do see a decrease in muscle. However, with periods of intermittent fasting, you don't see that same decrease in muscle mass, which is what we want. And it's likely driven by the fact that intermittent fasting drives us this process known as ketosis, which I'll be talking about here in a little bit. And ketones are very muscle sparing. They help prevent the breakdown of muscle tissue, which is very important for body composition, especially when we're trying to lose fat mass. The third one I want to talk about are the cognitive benefits of intermittent fasting. If you remember 2-3 years ago, it exploded all over Silicon Valley. Everyone was throwing butter in their coffee. They were saying, oh, this new fad, this new trend of people intermittent fasting and having buttered coffee and all these things to try and boost their cognitive performance. And the reality is that was real. People were doing that and it was happening over and over again. And people experienced a lot more clarity when they didn't load up and have a huge bagel or something for breakfast, and they kind of waited until lunch to eat. And there's rationale behind that and science to support it, because intermittent fasting actually increases something known as BDNF, which is brain-derived nootropic factor, and it increases something that you guys know I love, which is ketones, right? Intermittent fasting has been shown to increase your endogenous or your body's own production of ketones. And so you're providing that ketone source fuel to the brain, and you're increasing this BDNF, which is likely the reason why we see benefits in cognitive performance. The next one I want to talk about is growth hormone and insulin, right? Intermittent fasting affects these two hormones, right? Typically, prolonged periods of fasting have a lot more benefits for growth hormone. But when it comes to growth hormone and insulin, both of them, when you're decreasing insulin, actually helps liberate fatty acids, which means just breaking down a lot of our body fat, which may be the reason also contributing to the increase in ketones that we see with intermittent fasting. But both of these hormones are very important in anti-aging and longevity, and also very important in body composition. The next I want to talk about skin and inflammation. We've actually seen studies where you see a greater decrease in this CRP or C-reactive protein, a very important marker of inflammation, is greater, that decrease is greater when you're doing intermittent fasting than when you're calorically restricting. And there was a brand new study just published that showed that HOMA-IR, another marker of insulin resistance, was actually significantly lower in the group that did periods of intermittent fasting versus just caloric restriction alone. Again, showing another benefit that intermittent fasting isn't the same as just calorically restricting. It's not just equivocal. There's actually better benefits when you incorporate in intermittent fasting versus just calorie restricting alone. The last two I want to touch on, the first one is autophagy and cellular repair. I tried to draw these Pac-Man looking things, and that's really what's happening and how I try and depict autophagy going on in our body. It's like little Pac-Man going around cleaning up a lot of the debris and trash that we don't want inside of our bodies anymore, nor do we need. And so that's what autophagy is. And the question always is, when, Where, how long do I need to fast to get that autophagy? Well, first, it's important to understand that this autophagy, or this cellular cleansing that's happening with fasting, happens in different regions. It's not just a generalized response. Different tissues respond differently to this autophagy. So you have autophagy in your brain, in your muscle, in some of your other organs. It's region specific. And so that's very, very important to remember. And then also, when does it start happening? With fasting alone, we typically see elevations in some of these autophagy markers around the 72-hour mark. And I know that sounds shocking. I know that sounds like a very, very long time. But likely there's some underlying degree of autophagy happening throughout each one of those hours, and throughout kind of just our general lives, even when we're sleeping. Because autophagy is not just this on-off switch where it's either on or it's off. There's likely some underlying level that's happening, and it just slowly amplifies and gets higher and higher and higher the longer the fast. Later on, I'll tell you about one of the ways to accelerate this process even more than just fasting. And then the last one I want to talk about is the therapeutic benefits of intermittent fasting or fasting. There's research on cancer, Alzheimer's, there's even research on traumatic brain injury and Parkinson's. But with cancer in animals, they've seen long-term survival of animals who have incorporated in fasting increase by 40%. And one of the reasons that this happens is because fasting actually has pathways that increases the sensitivity of our cells to chemotherapy and radiation, right? So it makes it so that the dose that we need to get the same benefit is actually less, and the cells become more sensitized to it. So it's having a better effect when you're incorporating in those standard of care. And so they've actually seen that in humans with cancer as well. So again, maybe a strategy or something to talk with someone's doctor about how to kind of maybe incorporate in periods of intermittent fasting if they're going through periods of chemo and radiation. And then with Alzheimer's, the reason why we're likely seeing benefits is due to that autophagy probably going on in the brain, cleaning up a lot of that debris and plaques and tau proteins that have accumulated in the brain, but also due to increasing ketones, which we know has benefits for Alzheimer's. So next I want to jump into what is the best eating window? What's the best, right? It's the number one question. Do I have to fast for 12 hours, 14 hours? Here's the options that I want to kind of present to you. There's obviously several others. It's not black or white. It's not something where it's like at this point is the minimum dose that you need to get a benefit, and then this one exponentially increases your results. Our bodies are very complex physiological systems. It's not that once you hit the 16-hour mark, something immediately turns on. It's very individualized and really depends on a variety of factors. But here's the typical ones that people incorporate in. So 14 hours of fasting, 10 hours of eating. 16 hours of fasting, which is one of the most popular. 8 hours of eating, 18 hours and 6 hours. 20 hours of fasting, 4 hours of eating. And then incorporating in possibly even 24-hour fast, which I'll talk about a little hack that you can incorporate in a 24-hour fast in. But these are the typical options that people incorporate or utilize. I will say I would highly recommend at minimum this 14 hours and 10-hour eating window. I think most people can get away with that, right? If you think about that, what that would mean is like for anyone that isn't eating even the best or healthiest diet, that would mean like eating breakfast at 8 a.m. and then eating your dinner and finishing it up by 6 p.m. That's a pretty long window, right? If you're thinking about incorporating it. I think that's like the minimum dose that you would want. But then obviously you can get benefits throughout some of these other aspects. So let me give you an example. This right here is a 16-8 example. And so if you look at like waking up at 6 a.m., if you're like me, it's like 5 or 6 a.m. you're waking up, and then you go to bed at 10 p.m. That if you're looking at an 8-hour eating window, that would mean you're eating between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., right? So you're probably not waking up first thing in the morning and having anything to eat. You're waiting till maybe 10, maybe 11 a.m., and then you're eating your dinner and finishing it up by about 6 p.m. That would be that 8-hour eating window. And so I want to share with you my plan for what I do during the week. So that way you guys can get a little bit of sense of like, hey, if I want to copy what Ryan does, this is what Ryan does. I'm very simple in the sense that Sunday night to Monday night, I do a 24-hour fast. That's just like standard every single week, and I'll give you a little hack on how to do that. Tuesday through Friday, I typically, and I don't like count down the exact hour, but I typically am around that 16:8. Tuesday through Friday. Sometimes I'm even closer to the 18:6. I really eat maybe like late in the morning or early in the afternoon, and then I just have dinner. I'm fairly simple during the week because I'm usually head down working away. And then on Saturday and Sunday, I might be more in that 14:10 or that 16:8. Typically on the weekends, I'll pick one day during the weekend, and that's when like I'll have breakfast with my family, and I'll enjoy maybe an omelet or something like that. But I typically don't have breakfast in the typical sense during the week. I usually leave that for the weekends when I'm more active and kind of walking around and doing things with family and friends. That's my plan. If you want to replicate it, that's awesome. If you have a different plan, I'd love to see it in the comments and share with everyone your plan that you're incorporating in. So here's a little 24-hour fast hack, right? If you think about it, it's quite simple to kind of put this together. So typically what I do on Sundays is I try and finish up my dinner by 4 p.m. And that's done strategically to prepare. So that way I know that Monday at night at 4 p.m. is when I can kind of break that fast, or when I'm kind of finishing up that 24 hours, which is the perfect time for me every single week, and it's like clockwork. And the reason that is because if I finish up by 4, it's a lot easier for me to kind of fast into the night. Make sure on Sunday I'm trying to get in bed by 9 or 10 o'clock. And then you have this long period really where a lot of that fasting time is done while you're sleeping, right? And it's a lot easier to kind of ease into that longer 24-hour fast if you've never done it before. And your reality is you really have between 6 a.m. if you're waking up at 6 a.m. and 4 p.m. is really that hard time when you're really alert, really awake. And that's kind of that grind time. If you are kind of going through that 24-hour fast for the first time, that's that time where you really need to kind of buckle down if your goal is to do the 24 hours. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of eating window is there needs to be a little bit of precaution for women. It's not truly the same for men and women. Women who are still menstruating go through various different hormonal fluctuations throughout the month, which can cause some challenges. And so I would just put some precautions for women during their luteal phase, which is post-ovulation, is probably not the best time where you want to go on a 72-hour fast, right? It's probably not that time. Your body's kind of ramping up to kind of be like, hey, baby making mode. Probably not the best time to add a really big stressor, because fasting is in some essence a stress. So you just want to make sure you're taking that into consideration, is understanding throughout your cycle how you might want to incorporate in some of those harder, more intense fast, or maybe you need to back off a little bit and kind of give your body what it needs at that moment. The next thing I want to talk about is what to eat before and after. And one of the top questions that we get is like, what can I have before and what can I have after? So I have up here really what's the worst thing you can have before and what's the worst thing you can have after. And then maybe what's the best thing you can have before and what's the best thing you can have after. So if we're going to pick the worst thing you could have before embarking on an intermittent fasting, it would be things like candy, right? Donuts, just highly processed foods. And the reason is because if you look at what happens to your body during that time, you're going to eat that food and you're going to get this huge rise in glucose. And when you get that huge rise in glucose, typically your body's going to secrete insulin. And when you secrete insulin, that triggers the glucose to come down. And sometimes you go hypoglycemic. At that point in which you go hypoglycemic is when you start to get really hungry, right? Your body's sensing, hey, my blood sugar's really low. And so if you've ever had a lot of candy, or if you've ever gone to like a buffet and had some food that's like has a ton of sugar on it or a ton of carbohydrates, you come home And typically, like, you ate enough calories that would have lasted you for 3 days, but like an hour later, you're starving, likely because you just went hypoglycemic. And so a lot of times when you go hypoglycemic, it triggers these responses to be like, you're ridiculously hungry, you're starving. And if you do that right before you're embarking on intermittent fast, it's going to be a lot harder to achieve that. So you want to stay away from a lot of these highly processed carbohydrates, high sugar foods, before you embark on uh, an intermittent fast. The best things that you would want to do before is you want low to moderate amount of fat, right? Fat's slow digesting. You're kind of introducing your body and maybe even giving it some substrate to produce those ketones with. You want a moderate to high amount of protein. We also know that protein is very satiating and it helps nourish the body. And you're about to embark on this maybe 18 hours or 20 hours or 24-hour fast. So you want to make sure you're getting ample protein. And you want a moderate amount of fiber. We know that fiber helps keep us full. It can also get broken down inside of the gut to produce things like butyrate, which is very good for our bodies. But you want to kind of prepare yourself, not gorge and have this enormous meal, but you want to give yourself a nice, highly satiating meal before you kind of embark on a longer fast. So let's talk about what's the worst thing to have after. The worst thing you want to do after is go to a buffet, right? That's the worst thing you'd want to do, is because your body's not ready for that. And one of the things that happens right here is after prolonged periods of fasting, your stomach's ability, there's certain cells inside of your stomach, actually decrease their capacity to relax or expand. It's not really that so much that your stomach shrinks. Your stomach has a pretty finite size, but its ability to stretch and contract is actually changed after prolonged periods of fasting. And so it can't expand as much. And so that's when you start getting like, oh my gosh, that feeling where like you went and you ate a ton and it's now destroying your stomach. You feel like trash. It feels like you're about to give birth. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is really painful. You don't want to do that. But instead, what you want to do is you want to have something that's higher in protein, right? You want to have something that's like a nice high satiety meal, but good quality protein, right? That could be a shake, right? A nice blended up protein shake with a little bit of fats, quality fats in there. It could be some bone broth, right? Having some bone broth, especially after prolonged fast, is probably a really good idea. Anything 48 to 72 hours or longer, you really want to ease back into introducing your stomach to food. It hasn't seen that in over a day. So likely you want to kind of give your body its rest and slowly start introducing foods back into it versus crushing a buffet. And I'm all for the Brazilian buffets, but you got to be careful, especially when coming out of a fast. That's not the time when you go and chow down 5,000, 10,000 calories of meat. Probably not the best idea. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is the $1,000,000 question, right? Really the $1,000,000 question that everyone asks: what breaks a fast? And before I go into that, the first question you need to ask yourself when thinking about this question is, what is my goal, right? By definition, consumption of any calories would break a fast, right? Even coffee, even black coffee, has a little bit of calories in it. So by definition, that would break your fast. Now, before you freak out, what's actual reality of what's going to get the benefit of fasting? If your goal is to get some of these benefits of fasting and not just truly stick to the definition of a dry fast or even a water fast, but you still want to achieve these benefits and kind of fight through an 18-hour, 24-hour fast, then we're talking a similar language, and you're probably taking more of an approach that I do. And that means that coffee is okay. It does not break a fast, right? I'll put an X there. So that way you know it does not break a fast. A black coffee, or even having coffee with a little bit of fat. Now, I'm not saying put an entire stick of butter inside of your coffee. I'm not recommending that. But having a little bit of fat inside of your coffee would not break the benefits of your fast. However, having a ton of sugar inside of your coffee would break your fast. You're going to get an insulin response. You're kind of negating everything that you were setting out to do. So it depends, right? Do ketones break your fast? Exogenous ketones. When consumed in a moderate amount, they will not break your fast. There are studies showing that ketone esters consumed at high amounts, like 20, 30 milliliters, can actually trigger an insulin response. When your body's getting over that like 3 millimolar, it can trigger an insulin response, and that would negate a lot of those effects that we're looking for with fasting. So in moderate amounts, things that bump you by 0.5, 1, 1.5 millimolars, you're not going to get that insulin response, so it would not break that fast or the benefits of that fast. Does broth? In moderate amounts, it will not. Yes, it has some amino acids, which might temporarily have some effect on insulin, but the reality is, unless you're consuming a ton of it, it's a moderate amount, and even if it does increase insulin a little bit, you're going to be really quickly back in there because it's a different insulin response than you get with something like sugar, right? So broth really wouldn't do it. Unflavored electrolytes, or even flavored electrolytes that aren't flavored with sugar, would not break a fast, and actually highly recommended. I think this is probably the number one thing for people who are just starting out going on some period of intermittent fasting or fasting. I would highly, highly, highly recommend find yourself a good electrolyte, supplement with that during your periods of intermittent fasting, because when insulin's low, when insulin is low, your body increases the excretion of electrolytes, right? So when insulin's low, which happens with periods of fasting, like we talked about what happens with the hormones, you excrete out a lot of these electrolytes. And so that's when you can start to get a little bit of a headache, and you're starting to feel hangry, and you're having some of these negative side effects, and you're like, oh, fasting stinks. A lot of that can easily be fixed with hydration and electrolytes. So highly recommend those. Amino acids and protein, it really depends, right? The devil's in the dose, and it really ultimately comes down to your goal. Can you have a small amount, like I said, with the bone broth, or even just straight essential amino acids? Probably. You might get a little bit of an insulin response, but it would be gone very, very, very quickly, and you would kind of get right back into it. Now, if you're going and eating protein, or you're having a huge protein shake, that would likely knock you out of this fasting state. It wouldn't be the end of the world, but again, it's not ideal if your goal is to kind of get a lot of those benefits we talked on. You probably don't want to go have 100 grams of a protein shake during your fasting window, right? Probably save that for right after. And then I've seen this one a lot. This one gets a lot of attention. It's something called Prolon. It's this fasting mimicking diet, and people are like, "Oh, I'm fasting. I'm eating Prolon." I think it's a brilliant marketing technique, right? It's a fasting mimicking diet. But if you look at the products, like they actually don't. They have like a bar in here. I'm pretty sure that bar has like honey in it, which definitely would knock you out of a fasting state. They have olives, right? They have like some teas, which are probably fine. They have some soups, which I believe have some carbs and sugars in it. So it's interesting to me. I think Walter Longo is actually a brilliant scientist, but I believe this is his kind of company or whatever. But it's interesting because like this would not. This is basically caloric restriction. It's a way to put together a kit that's going to allow you to calorically restrict. It's not something I would recommend if your goal is to get some of those other benefits of actual fasting. The last thing I want to talk on is how can I accelerate the benefits, right? We've kind of gone through what is intermittent fasting. We've gone through what breaks a fast, what doesn't break a fast, what should my eating window be. We've covered a lot on intermittent fasting. Now the question is, great, I'm going to start intermittent fasting. I'm going to choose one of those windows. I might even incorporate in and do the same thing Ryan does, where I do a 24-hour fast once a week. I do maybe 16 hours of fasting during the weekdays, and maybe I extend that and only do maybe 14 hours during the weekends. Great. Now you've done that. How can you accelerate the benefits? Movement is the number one thing that you can do to accelerate the benefits of intermittent fasting. Besides fasting, if your goal is autophagy, the number one thing on top of fasting that you can do is exercise. Exercise has more studies showing benefits for autophagy than fasting ever has. We know that exercise is the most important thing for autophagy. So whether that's getting out and just getting in your steps, which is great if that's where you're at, make sure you're getting 10,000 steps a day, but ideally doing some form of resistance training or high intensity interval training. High intensity interval training would be great. You're helping your body deplete those muscles, those glycogen stores. You're really ramping up something known as AMPK, which is great. It's kind of going to help with that autophagy process. But movement during that will help tremendously. And guess what it'll also do? It'll help lower or blunt hunger. So if you're someone who's like, I'm struggling, I'm doing this 24-hour fast, right? I'm on Monday, and it's like the middle of the day, and you have 4 more hours, and you really want to get to that 24-hour mark, go take a walk. I promise you, by the time you come back from that walk, especially if it's like maybe a mile, go take a mile walk, and when you come back, it'll actually help blunt your hunger, which is a great strategy to implement in and can actually help accelerate your benefits. Obviously, diet, right? You know I'm a big proponent of the ketogenic diet. I think intermittent fasting, like I said, it isn't a diet. It's a tool that you can use, and it's an eating pattern. But your diet around the periods of intermittent fasting can be very beneficial, right? Making sure you're carb conscious, ideally lower carb ketogenic, will be super helpful in making that transition towards fasting easier. It's one of the reasons why you see people who are low carb or keto have no problem or have a lot easier time fasting than someone who's eating 300, 400, 500 grams of carbohydrates. It's very difficult for them because they're on a blood sugar roller coaster all the time. People who are on keto, it's very easy to incorporate in periods of intermittent fasting. And then supplementation, right? Supplementation is one of the most important things that you can incorporate in during this period of fasting. Like I said, electrolytes is a huge one. I think electrolytes can be extremely beneficial since you are kind of lowering or excreting out a lot of those electrolytes when insulin's low and you're fasting. You can incorporate in ketones. And even outside of the fasting window, you can incorporate in certain things that help lower blood glucose, like berberine and some of these other things that I've talked about before, that help you make this fasting process easier. And I put it here twice because I think it's so important. But the number one benefit of intermittent fasting is this word, control. We talked about a lot. I talked about the benefits from anti-aging, from body composition, and everything in between. The number one benefit that I can promise you that you will achieve when you incorporate in intermittent fasting is you are putting appetite back in your control. That is priceless. We live in a world now that isn't like our ancestors with this feasting and famine. We have food available to us all day, 24/7, 365. You can log onto an app and have food delivered to you. You could probably drive less than 5 minutes and you'll find food somewhere at a convenience store, grocery store, wherever. We have a bunch of food in the pantries and things like that. We have refrigerators now and freezers that can hold food. We have food available to us 24/7, 365, right? We are not prone to that feast and famine. However, because of that, that's had many advantages to helping prevent things like starvation. But it's also had many downsides contributing to the obesity crisis because we have food available to us 24/7, 365. And so the key that we need to do, and one of the major benefits of intermittent fasting, is putting appetite back in our control. We are no longer controlled by the food choices, and we're making the conscious effort to eat and say, great, I don't need to time or be specific with it, but like I'm listening to my body. I'm inherently knowing, hey, it's time for me to eat, not, oh, I just woke up and I just bought a fresh thing of donuts and it's pulling at me because it's sitting in my pantry. I'm not even really hungry. I'm just going to go have some out of convenience or because of stress and things like that. So it helps put appetite back in your control. And that is the number one benefit that I can say out of everything on intermittent fasting. So I hope you guys learned a ton on this exercise and on this video with intermittent fasting. Let me know down in the comments what other topics you want me to touch on. And if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with friends and family. I'll talk to you soon.